Good to go.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the December 9th Government Operations Committee. Welcome, everybody. Today we have two main topics. That's continuation of LBAs and BACs. And thanks to Nicia for sending out the meeting minutes for our October meeting. Can I get a motion for approval?
I'll move to approve.
Second. All in favor, say aye. October meeting minutes are approved. And we'll kick off with land bank authorities.
Sure. So I believe that since our last meeting, we've done a deeper dive on some of the tools that are or not before the Land Bank Authority. And Austin or Courtney, I don't know if you want to share that summary, if you want me to, but basically it's when it comes to any kind of funding mechanisms, it's pretty narrow. And that's around their enabling language. So specifically, if a land bank authority is going to be doing some of these acquisitions, it really needs to focus on tax delinquent, dilapidated, and blighted properties. Now we are seeing that LBAs will sometimes deal in vacant properties under those guidelines. But what it doesn't mean is that you would be going and buying a functioning apartment complex or an existing single family home in good condition and then flipping it into an affordable purpose. And so what that really means in the context of our discussion is the affordable housing investment strategies that the Mayor and Commission has made in this budget cycle. The idea that the Land Bank Authority can really deploy them is going to be very narrow and probably really a conversion around the affordable housing investment strategy, or I'm sorry, around the strike fund, should they choose to. But ultimately, we're going back to what the charge is here. The charge is whether or not ACC Gov wants to use a Land Bank Authority. So we just felt like it was really important to tell you that. Similarly, the Attorney's Office has helped us look at there's actually two prior resolutions around the Land Bank Authority, and we've compared that to state law. And it appears that the current resolutions that have been used fully encompass the tools that are available by state law. So what that really means is that if this group has a recommendation to restart a Land Bank Authority, step one is just conducting interviews and appointing members. Which in the past have in fact included commissioners and or staff, but that's up to the Mayor and Commission as a whole. So should you choose to restart a land bank authority, it's pretty simple. And there's not a lot of nuance that's needed there. What we wanted to cover today was what it would look like to restart a land bank authority. And so in the past meeting, we had the gentleman join us and review some of their programmatic work. There's a lot of variations of flavor around land bank authorities. So you see some that are more active in the tax side, where they're dealing with tax delinquent properties and maybe even capturing those individuals in a partnership with an affordable housing partner before they end up on the courthouse steps. You see others that are dealing more in vacant lots and side lot disposition. You see some that are very active in and public property disposition. It really depends on the nature of what that community has before it. But what we do see universally around a high functioning land bank authority is that they have some form of full-time staff. And that seems to range from anywhere from 1 to more than 4. If you all were to recommend moving forward, I would just suggest, this will be in its infancy. So you wouldn't normally come out of the gate with a whole team of staff until you're really focused on your purpose. But I know Melinda has pulled together, and Marquita have pulled together just some examples of other authorities' budgets and even a conceptual budget, not at all with the idea that you would adopt a conceptual budget for an organization that doesn't have even a board at this point, but just to give you some kind of magnitude of scale of what kind of investments are needed to sustain a land bank authority. And so with that, I'll, Melinda, just let me know what you'd like us to pull up and we'll have it ready.
Let's start with the peer community review.
Yeah.
I think I'll wait till we finish.
Yeah.
You sure?
Yeah. I'll wait till we finish.
Okay, so the peer community review document is, the affordable housing staff reached out to different communities that have active land bank authorities, just to get an understanding of their breakout, what they do, how they function, staffing, and their primary functions. So you all have a copy of that, comprehensive breakdown. But we also have access to Macon Bibb, Rome Floyd, and Metro Atlanta Land Bank budgets, which I've given you a copy of, you have as well. So if you want to pull up maybe Rome Floyd Land Bank Authority's budget.
That's making.
There you go. Okay, so Rome Floyd is one of the smaller land banks. They have one, ooh. What is that?
Crazy.
I think that is this, there we go, cast it.
They have one employee, and you see that they have a general operating revenue that is generated from their property sale proceeds of 600,000. And then they have a 75% tax allocation recovery budget. But for now, they dedicated 500,000 from their ARPA funding, and Floyd County also committed ARPA funding for this. So what that implies is that they've been operating for a while. They've generated enough revenue from sales. But they do have a full-time position, staff. They have regular office expenses, office operating. They have a software program, property management software program that they use to manage and maintain the properties that they have. And then they have property expenses. So, I mean, this is a pretty comprehensive breakdown, but based on their current budget, they're operating at 1 million, what was that down?
1.6.
1.6 million or 1.16 million at this time. Another budget, if you want to pull up Macon Bibb.
Yeah, I was gonna ask about that.
Maybe expand it, maybe make it bigger. There we go. So they actually do have general funds invested into Macon Bibb. They have a $600,000 24-25 budget. They also have revenue that they've got invested 150,000. So their current budget is 750,000. And again, you see that they have 3 positions. Currently, they have an executive director, they have a coordinator that's specific to property acquisition, and then they have an office manager. They also have administrative expenses, including of course, you're gonna have a CPA, payroll, and just all the general office operations. And then you move down to where they actually have a vehicle expense. And they also have their professional services. So that's where you get into where they have a legal consultant, and they also have appraisal services and an external audit and accounting. And they're down to the very bottom, please, sir. Their annual expenses for right now for 24 are 700,000, and then proposed 647,324 for FY 24 and 25. So that's where they're running.
And so these are mature land banks that are in different communities. They've been around for a while. You see in the case of Macon, they've got multiple staff. They also have unique missions, right? So at Macon, what Judd has shared with us is that there were a lot of blighted properties. And so their role has really been heavy on kind of community revitalization. In Athens, just to give you some context, we looked at tax sales that go unsold. So what's not being picked up by the free market, if you will, private market. And it's very small. There were around 10 total properties from the last 4 or so years that weren't sold at all. So what that means is if there was a focus on tax sales, it would actually be kind of competing with private investment. Now, the difference between a land bank and a private investment could be that a land bank is willing to make that purchase and then discount the land specifically to help with affordable housing, just as they might do if there was a vacant or blighted in-town property. But those all come at a financial loss, so to speak, because you're decreasing that value in order to enhance affordability.
So I'm gonna say the word discounted, you mean we buy it at market and then we sell it
Below market.
below market, okay?
And in some cases, you see even a transfer at no fee to like a nonprofit housing partner. So really, what they're really doing is becoming active in that acquisition. The other thing that we looked at was kind of the blighted properties list in Austin. Do you have a scale? Is it around 40 or so properties that remain on that list?
Sure. I can tell you that in terms of the properties, let me back up. So historically, the building inspections department will provide a list to the attorney's office of properties that are slated for a nuisance abatement hearing, properties that are not safe for habitation, things of that nature. We currently have about 10 of properties that have been turned over to the attorney's office.
Okay.
I can't speak to whether or not there are any others pending that haven't reached our office that may still be in code enforcement or building inspections.
And the ones I'm referencing may be a lower level of nuisance abatement. Another relevant point around that is in the recent history, as we have brought those things to a legal action, typically the property owners have intervened on their own accord.
That's correct.
So if you think about kind of coming out of the Great Recession, it was fairly common that we would have to get a court order and then demo a house and place a lien on the property in order to abate that nuisance. But now when people see us like that, they're gonna have to come to court and, you know, there's been some prior administrative actions. More and more often, action is being taken without government intervention. So.
Well, you also have the example that Savannah, Augusta, and a couple of others do where they are able to help clear heirs properties by purchasing and then getting the title cleaned up and then selling it back to the original homeowners in order for them to maintain ownership, but to get all of that cleared up. So that is a purpose a land bank can assist with is
I'd be interested
clearing
in
time.
pursuing that. That's a big need in our community.
Yeah.
It is.
Well, I spoke with the director of the Savannah one the other day, and they use Georgia Legal Services helps them with a lot of the heirs clearing. And then there's Georgia Heirs Property as well, who could, you know, so there's nonprofit partners
Yeah,
out
I mean,
there.
there's people out there who can't qualify for some of these home improvement because it's an heirs property and you don't
Exactly.
actually loan it.
Sure.
So that is something, a purpose that land can.
What's the general cost for doing the process of arrears? Do you have to, is that court costs? Like,
For heirs or for? I
like
think,
clearing it up? Do
You
you
got to think about that, clear it up, sometimes that can be a long.
yeah.
How many errors there are?
Exactly.
I mean, there could be 20, 30 errors out there and that.
Just in my district, one of my constituents, still they had about 10 or 15 people. They finally got it cleared. It took them, almost 3 years
Wow.
to get it cleaned up. Like, I ended up calling down to the court because they felt like after they had did all the paperwork, it was sort of steady and then
Yeah.
it started moving, but it takes a while sometimes. You gotta-
Yeah.
Well, and that's a smaller, you know, if you only have 10, there are some properties that have as upwards of 256 because it branches. It
Yeah.
starts with 1, it goes to 2, and then it gets to a point where every relative has a portion of ownership. So I mean, it can get really ugly, but that could be a part of the legal consultant fee.
Okay,
As far as that would be a line item in their budget to have that kind of assistance to help with that clearing.
So my question I was gonna ask, and I'm glad that's why I said I want to wait. And I have to. Then because we don't have a whole lot of blighted. And it was just good, land. Is it worth it then for us to do a land bank? That, and I know we need to, I know people need housing and can we, you know, in that property, I like it, but is it worth it? Based on the community, based on the number of possible blighted, and, you know, I mentioned this earlier, then do we get in competition with private investors when they're safe? And should we be that benefit to compete with those investors when we're trying to get property? So that's a little bit my concern. I think land banks are great. But I'm just trying to figure, is it good for Athens-Clarke County? And I'm not,
That's it.
I
No, that's good.
like my colleagues to.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's worth pursuing for the purpose of that heirs property program. That, I think that is something that would be ideal for our community. And for the purpose of, you know, seeing to it that those handful of blighted properties that are out there, and they are out there, end up being affordable housing instead of flipping to luxury student housing, which is what the big challenge is, especially in our in-town neighborhoods. You know, if those were the only two purposes of a land bank authority, I'd be pretty okay with that, because those are both like serious needs.
Does building inspection, do they have tax delinquent, blighted, and vacant property list? A list of those?
Well, tax delinquent would be through the tax commissioner, and there is a list, and in fact, they do sales, it's, posted monthly, they don't do a sale monthly, because we don't have, you know, even that much demand on tax delinquent.
Okay.
So the blighted, and kind of nuisance abatement, yes, and so you have these ones that they're working administratively, where they're sending a property owner a notice, or maybe they're doing even some due diligence, because part of that nuisance abatement question is it worthwhile to rehab the structure, or does it really need to be torn down? And that's based on some value assessments. But ultimately, those that can't be resolved administratively then are partnered up with the attorney's office to take a more formal court action with our local nuisance abatement ordinance. So they do have that list, but it's not extensive.
We see that list, could we get a copy? I'd like to know how many properties that we have. That we
Sure.
take a look at it, and where they may be located at, you know, what are they more on the west side, east side, are they far out?
Yeah, because some of these home improvement programs out there are concentrated to certain neighborhoods.
Right.
And, you know, if we were to focus on those neighborhoods, there would also be programs to help rehab the properties.
Yeah, yes, sir, yeah.
Well, the other advantage of the land bank is the disposition of ACC property. That, for the purpose of affordable housing, that's where your land bank could play a key role.
Mhm.
Being able to dispose of ACC owned properties for below market value,
Yeah,
for the sole purpose of development.
and we'll have some property to unload when the municipal center comes up to function. I mean, it's several years off, but it will be there.
And I think the way to think about it, so it's not just tax delinquent properties, it's properties that are not producing tax revenue, right? So that's how you think about the government disposition of government property. So to get, the purpose is to get them back into tax producing role, and then the money used to, for affordable housing.
And on that front, I do think there's some opportunity. So, at one point we've discussed, not in this committee, but as with the body, the duplexes that are owned on Creekwood Drive. In my opinion, Athens-Clarke County should not own those duplexes. It's time that they return to either the private market or an affordable housing partner. We had one that was kind of fell in our lap on Barnett Shoals, but that's recently been designated by the Mayor and Commission for the library. But that was one that always in my mind was a potential affordable housing site. And then we have little onesies and twosies, but I'll tell y'all, I've looked at this with a team multiple times. When you look at Athens-Clarke County as a whole, you see a lot of ownership. And when you actually start to dive into it, you find that there's a lot of reasons why we own those properties and would recommend that we continue to own them. Many of them are floodplain, deed restricted, parks. So it is not, if you're thinking about to the point of scale, it is not a target rich environment, but there's certainly some flexibility that is offered through something like an authority, which is they can be maybe a little more restrictive than what the law says around public property disposition from ACC Gov. So for example, they can work with certain nonprofit partners, whereas we are more or less have to go to an open auction of that land. But if I felt like we were sitting on 30, 40, I'd say, yeah, even if you stood it up for 18 months, this is a great tool to move through. And I do think it should be looked at. I also want to kind of pivot a little bit to your point, which is it worth it? That's a discussion on that side of the table for sure. It's also one that maybe gains more clarity over time. And let me explain possible next steps. So here's just an example budget we put together. Looking at other communities, if you were to have one staff member, kind of an executive level, and then some contracted services and administrative space, and even just a small budget for acquisition, $360,000. That's a lot of money for just a single year of operating. And I think we're all familiar with our partners, authorities or otherwise, that first bite of the apple doesn't tend to be the only one, right? It grows over time. So you are in fact kind of creating a new public service, if you will. But what we wouldn't recommend to you is push $361,000 out the door. What we would recommend to you is if you wanted to investigate further, the discussion is probably time to leave GOC and actually go to an authority, right? And so how would you do that? How would you communicate your wishes and dreams to an authority that does not even exist with board members right now? Well, one is appoint board members, but two is to maybe have a resolution that conveys your desires. And this is just an example of the kinds of things you could cover. And let me pull this up on the shared screen so people can see that.
So the magic word, resolution.
Right. I know it's poorly timed.
I need to ask a question.
What?
I don't think that screen is shared, just.
Why is it not shared? Shared here. Okay, well, okay.
About resolutions. Is it better an ordinance more so than a resolution? Because in my mind, some resolution when they get written on, it is what it is, a resolution stating something. So would it give us more authority? Use this as the right word. It was the ordinance more so than a resolution. I refer to attorney's office. If we go with the land bank and make it, then we call it ordinance more so than a resolution.
Sure. I think a lot of it just depends on what your objectives are. So I can tell you that under state law, a resolution or an ordinance, they're both options.
What has more authority? I mean, what does the ordinance? To me, I'm thinking the ordinance is putting us, okay, we're gonna do this.
Yeah.
It holds us to some type of accountability.
Sure.
Where the resolution, in my mind, and maybe I'm wrong, you correct me, resolution don't.
I see what you're saying. No, I would say that an ordinance is an actual law that, you know, so I would think that would have more weight, so to speak.
Right.
But
For the purposes of the establishing of the land bank authority, resolution was perfectly appropriate. That was a perfectly appropriate tool. There's no resolution ordinance, it didn't matter. If the next step that Andrew's kind of proposing is a delineation of sort of the priorities, kind of what that would be up to you. I will say this, that those priorities may change over time and a resolution would be easier to just have another resolution as opposed to amending an ordinance.
Okay.
I mean, if that's kind of what
I think that's right. Probably you need 3 lawyers.
I'll give you our opinion. How about that?
I think resolutions are perfect for this kind of purpose where we're talking about like goals and things we want to work on. I think ordinances are best for things that you want to codify, that you want to have. I mean, not that all ordinances are codified because they're not, but most ordinances are going to end up in our muni code. They're going to be publicly visible. And so I think that's best left for when you have a definite, this structure, you know, this is how X is going to operate. And I'm not sure, I haven't heard from Andrea, but I'm not sure that that's where we are yet.
Yeah, this is more, so if you see enough meat on the bone that you wanted to move forward, this is basically conveying to the authority that you would then appoint members to. This is what we're hoping to see from you before any further commitments are made, right? So it almost like takes work out of this committee and puts it within the board to do that deeper dive. And so on that, I've covered some just basic stuff like a work plan and a budget and, a staffing approach. Like, how would you staff it? And what would you be working on? Similarly, speaking to housing affordability, since that is such an acute need in our community. But also speaking to, are we enhancing the activities of our partners? Because we don't want to just duplicate what's already being done. We have housing partners buying property right now for affordability, and we back them financially. But what's the actual little narrow area where you might improve upon that because you have extra legal authority or tools before you?
And that's the question I posed at our last one. I'm sorry, keep on. I'm sorry.
So this is kind of a first stab. Now, in this discussion today, I've heard some discussion around heirs property. So if you wanted to go that route, I would say that might be something you would put into a resolution. So this is kind of the point you're at, is do you want to put the board in place or authority in this case, put those members in place and have them do this work as guided by a resolution, and they'd come back to the mayor and commission as a whole with what they have to share? Or are we looking at the cost, potential public investment, which is really the only place I know that you would sustain this right now, and the narrow areas of benefit, and saying, you know what, maybe it's not worth our investments right now, and we just want to send this forward with no action?
As far as the resolution, again, it goes back to, you have the resolution, you have the board, and then you have your IGA. So your IGA could be written in a way that fully supports the resolution that you've agreed upon and limits their ability with your funds to go outside of that. But I think that is a reason why you see commissioners on boards of land banks a lot, is to ensure that that voice is at the table and ensures that what the county wants through this resolution is actually going through and
Yeah.
really a part of that IGA.
I think it's important to have one commissioner on it. Before it was not very functional with mostly commissioners on it. I feel like the people on the land bank need to be folks who are well versed in matters of real estate and finance. And that said, I think maybe what we should do is come up with a resolution that outlines the structure and offers up some goals and hand it over to that body and have them come up with the structure for meeting those goals.
Yeah, I agree.
So, well, I guess,
Now, do we need to, share our colleagues, should we maybe do as part of the work session, maybe, or some type of conversation, what we should have with the rest of our colleagues?
So if we approve this, this will, this resolution component will be passed to the full body. Then from there, we'll have that discussion.
the other thing you could choose to recommend to your colleagues right now is, there's been these investments that have been made or designated out of the Affordable Housing Special Revenue Fund, and we've talked about them quite a bit, the gap financing and the strike fund and the single family fund. And so those have actually consumed a lot of the resources that have been designated to it. We did get a budget report from staff, and there is some extra funding available. I can pull it up here. So right now there's around, let's call it $750,000 of funds in that account that are not named for a purpose yet. You could recommend an action to designate those funds in support of a future land bank authority, but doing so does not permanently commit you to use them for that purpose. It also, you would not distribute funds to a land bank authority until they came back to you with a plan and it was constituted into an IGA, right? So all it would do for us as staff is it would create a new line item that we know to hold those funds, so that when there's inquiries about how much funding is available, we say, well, after you net out all of the designations, you have X available. And so if you wanted to do that, we could recommend some numbers to you. Or you could leave it undesignated, but just know if the authority comes forward with the greatest plan ever that you love and they're asking for public support to implement it, if between now and then this funding is spent or designated somewhere else, you either then have to kind of undesignate some commitments, or you run the risk that you would put further general fund support into something like this. So I would say as a best practice, if you want to go that route, I would recommend that you designate funds for a future operations. And based on our budgets, it depends on what you would want, but what kind of scale would they be looking at, Melinda?
Well, I was gonna say, this is the fund I was talking about in the last meeting, as far as what could be used, rather than from the general operating budget could do this. And I'm sorry, you're.
If they wanted to consider a scale for 1 or 2 years of a fledgling land bank authority to come out for money for operations, we talking $300,000 to $500,000?
I would absolutely, for the next 2 years, allocate at least 500,000, toward that inception. Because if they're up and running
Designate.
the first year, they may be able to actually do some acquisition or some sale and generate some revenue, and they wouldn't need as much to supplement in the second year. But I would say the first year, you're operating from scratch.
Right, as we would, that first year, all the expenses will be paid out of that money until it start generating.
Yeah.
Likely, but again, what we're doing is designating the funds for a future conversation, that they come back and be very clear on what those funds would be used for.
Yeah.
But even if you were to say, take something like, the Creekwood duplexes that we discussed, poor condition, those duplexes are probably still worth $80,000, per building. So that's good seed money, but it still takes activity to market them, to get them in the hands of your partners. Like, there's a lot of front end work that's got to go into getting them sold just to put that money back in the bank.
Is that the only duplex we own?
It's 2 duplexes on Creekwood. Those are the only duplexes that we own.
I think it's somewhere off of Tennessee Road.
Those are the.
That's it. That's Creekwood.
Okay, that's.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, it's on, that's how it is.
Only in my district.
It's gonna be close between
It's
you
on
and Thick.
Stephanie's thing.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's Vaughn Road and then off of Vaughn.
Okay, yeah.
So
Let me, but I do want to see what we got though, if you can get those properties that tax and assessor had.
Yeah.
It's like, so,
You
The
want,
list.
do you want the list of ACC Gov properties and the tax assessors?
I will say, I'm just, the land bank does actually own a couple properties.
They
Yeah, they
do.
actually do already own a couple of properties.
I don't know, I mean, Andrew knows more about the properties, I don't know how marketable they are, but there are 5 or 6 properties
Yeah.
currently owned by the
that's what I'm
state.
saying.
yeah,
Yes,
they're in little land bank purgatory right now.
Yeah. So if you get that land bank up and running, they will already have 5 properties that they can work with.
I think what may help us, and again, is watching everything we do. We had a land party some time ago,
Mhm.
and obviously it's disbanded in some form or fashion.
Mhm.
So we're trying to recreate that, but we got property that's sitting sort of in that land banks, okay?
Yeah.
Well, and you're trying to develop a land bank, a functioning land bank authority, whereas in the past, it was pretty much a volunteer
Yeah.
board, and it didn't have a manager, it had no executive director, so we're really trying to help it get it structured as a functioning land bank authority, close to the ones that you see in Macon, Bibb, and Savannah, that are very successful because they have their man, they have personnel, and they're carrying out their
Okay.
directives.
So thinking about our next and hopefully final discussion on this, we'll bring back information on ACC ownership, tax list, and nuisance abatement. So you can see the scale of those 3 opportunities. And then would you be interested in having staff work with the attorney's office to take this resolution and make it a kind of a proper resolution? And if so, is there anything else you would want covered or not covered versus what's up here? I did add in heirs property.
So what,
Go ahead.
we can go back now, when we first got the land bank started, that was a resolution for that, right? So do we go back maybe sort of redefine that and tighten it up some more? Or do we use what we had in the past? I guess I'm trying to keep reinventing the wheel.
Yeah,
To me, maybe just tighten up what we had in the past and add in those things that we talked about.
The original resolution was around nuisance abatement. So I think what you're wanting to do is expand it.
Well, the original resolution, I happen to have it pulled up right this minute. Was the purpose of returning land, which is non-revenue generating, non-tax producing status to effective utilization status in order to provide housing, new industry and jobs for citizens of the county. So that's the stated purpose in the original resolution. And then when the Georgia Land Bank Act, when there were reforms to the law, in order to indicate your continued interest in operating as a land bank authority, you had to pass a new resolution saying we're gonna remain in the land bank authority now under the new act, and we're gonna add one member to our, so there's two resolutions that have just built upon each other. But that second resolution never changed the priorities or the sort of purpose of the land bank, right?
So
okay,
I think this, if you have a new resolution, it's just going to be more clearly expounding on
Right.
the more detailed as far as what you really want this land bank purpose to serve.
okay, what is the county's definition of blighted and vacant property? Vacant property would be somebody owns it, but there's nothing on it.
Yeah.
In my mind, I'm thinking, like, the woods in my backyard, that's vacant, it's not developed. So what would be the definition for vacant property and blighted?
And dilapidated.
Yeah,
Those are three.
We can do blight and dilapidated.
Yeah, I think when you're thinking about dilapidated properties or abandoned properties, what you're really thinking about, are the cases that are scheduled for nuisance abatement hearing. And those are properties that under the nuisance abatement ordinance, the building official has determined that they're not safe for habitation due to dilapidation or severe damage to the exterior of the structure, things of that nature.
So blighted and dilapidated, there will be a structure that's not maintained.
Blighted's different though, isn't it?
So I was thinking about it from the perspective of the unsafe dwelling ordinance. I can tell you that under the state law for the Georgia Land Bank, the focus is on, because I don't know that the word blight appears in there. It specifically says abandoned properties, tax delinquent properties, and dilapidated properties.
And the Georgia the Land Bank Act does not define dilapidated, so we have to look to, we have to look to things like the nuisance
Like
abatement.
the unsafe dwelling.
Marquita, did you come off of mute?
Yes, I did. I was just gonna add one comment based off of what Courtney just read in the resolution regarding the producing taxes for those properties. So the list that was provided by the tax commissioner, it's about 10 properties. They all are vacant, but obviously they're not generating any taxes because they weren't sold in the tax sale. So those would be properties. As for Commissioner Davenport, that might be the definition of the vacant properties that's non-producing taxes.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll return to you with those things and hopefully we'll have some products that you'll be able to land this topic. Anything else y'all want to discuss on land banks before we have a quick touch base on BACs?
So our objective is affordable housing. Work with partners to turn that vacant property to taxes by, affordable housing. If you look at Rome, Florida and Augusta, they do parks and neighborhood revitalization as well. Should that be captured in our resolution?
It's already part of the bylaws in the existing existing bylaws for land bank, I think what you're wanting to do is emphasize that your primary focus is affordable housing, but it doesn't eliminate their ability to do,
Okay.
because you may want them to help with the disposition or with management of a property that's ACC Gov owned, for maintenance purposes. Maybe you want them to turn something into a park. I mean, that is something they could do. So you don't want to limit them to not being able to do anything, but it's just that your emphasis would be on affordable housing activities.
And my final question for Saunders, why would the government want to hold property for future, is it for future development or plan?
You mean within our current ownership? Yes, so, there's some examples. Over in the eastern side of the county, out towards Winterville, we had a few properties that came to us, I think through tax sale, and we recognized that they were either on or adjacent to the Firefly Trail, and so we went ahead and held those until the trail was finalized. That way we weren't having to negotiate for easements on them. There's also, for example, in the current SPLOST 2020, there's a project for a West Side Park, and it very much speaks to land acquisition only. And that's not uncommon. So we actually have a green space acquisition off of Tallahassee Road that is, at its core, it's about protecting natural resources, but there is a vision to have a park, and in fact, a SPLOST project for that as well. There are other places where we might own, another weird one is bridges. So if you think about when you build a bridge, you tend to build a bridge right next to it. And sometimes that creates these little fragments of property where the old bridge was. But we're in the business of lasting forever. So what we would do is we wouldn't sell those remnants where the old bridge was. We save them, and then in 50 years, we build the new bridge where the old bridge was, right? So you just kind of bounce back and forth. That's a lot of what we've done, is looked at, is there critical infrastructure here? Are there future plans here? What do we need it for? And then you slowly get down to these lists of the odd ducks where you're like, no, nobody really knows why we should own that anymore. Let's cut it loose.
So I understand there's quite a bit of property we own that's floodplain, and
Correct.
we own it for good reason. You
Right.
really want to encourage development on that. But I understand some of these parcels are large and only part of them is floodplain. I had someone point some out to me on Sandy Creek. There are multiple acres, and just like, the back 100
Sure.
feet of them is floodplain. Could we look into partitioning those parcels?
You can do restricted deeds on development in the floodplain area, and development could be allowed in the non, but you'd also want to make sure that you had some type of flood insurance,
And specific to Sandy Creek, there actually was a SPLOST 5 project, I believe, called the Sandy Creek Buffer Expansion. And the entire idea is that they would acquire up and down the Sandy Creek, not only the floodplain, but the kind of river basin to protect Sandy Creek. And Sandy Creek, at the last time I looked, was our only unlisted creek. So it was the only one not listed for pollution. Do we have to own them? Maybe not, but we would probably deed restrict them in such a way that they were consistent with that SPLOST project.
Okay.
So it's not hard. When you start to pull at the thread of ACC property ownership, it unravels quickly. And so what we will do is try to very quickly take you down to the end of the unravel. This is the low-hanging fruit. Does that mean that there aren't other opportunities? No, but they become increasingly complex.
And I would say, as far as, we've been working with budget and strategic analysis to create a mapping tool to determine which ACC Gov properties would be eligible for development, affordable housing development. I think we, 5, maybe?
Yeah.
Maybe 5 that have come up that would be good for development of affordable housing. But again, you don't want to restrict your land bank to only doing affordable housing. There are potentially other properties that could be used for other ACC Gov interest activities that they're more suited for rather than affordable housing. We'll get you that list, but I think we've identified maybe 5.
Okay.
So we got our marching orders.
we're ready.
Two, I guess, not only would get enough information, but have a resolution. And something like that.
Next week.
I think next week.
Sure, like, no.
Thank you. I'm sure we can get there.
January.
And I just wanted to have a quick touch base on BAC. So we've gone on a lot of journeys here. We've got some clarity around some updates that will be recommended with the policy manual. But this group's decided they wanted to take a little deeper focus on the tier 2 BACs, those that are locally controlled and managed predominantly through ordinance. And so following that, out of the last meeting, we actually sent a survey to you all. Got some results back. We got 4 results.
Are you serious? That's about the ask. How many?
Well, 4 out of 5 is decent, but then we sent it to the full commission. I believe we got 8 results because I'm not going to count the fact that you submitted it twice. So at this point, you all have taken the temperature of your peers on these tier 2 BACs. And what I wanted to do was share that with you today and talk about opportunities for next steps. So, and it's just going to go one at a time. I've kind of gone by these planning and quasi-judicial ones first. So there was 100% consensus amongst those surveyed that it should remain as is, and we would say, let's do that. Historic Preservation Commission, again, not a ton of appetite to do anything different. And we would note that they have a heavy presence in the review process that would have to go either to yourselves or staff if they weren't there. So based off of this, we would recommend no changes. Construction Board of Appeals is the one that's existed but never has heard a case. It is required by state law to have some form of an appeal process. Seemed like there was a real appetite here to combine it in some form or fashion. And the most common note was with the hearings board. Now we will note that these are very technical. Like it's a question of how can this plumbing interconnect or what does code say? But what we would recommend to you all based off of this is we'll go and investigate this combination, see with staff, would this make sense to fold it in as a function of the hearings board? And if it doesn't, we would probably come back to you and show you what the alternative looks like around delegating that back to DCA. But based off of what we saw, probably would not recommend that it retain in its current function. Hearings board, again, there was this thing around combination, but it was again pinpointing that construction board of appeals. There was no other recommended combination strategy, so that's what we'd be looking at. And from here, we get into I've actually combined, sorry, I don't know why this stuff, Jeff, you'll have to teach me how to make AI and stuff, Brandon. I don't want AI today. So this is actually 2 different boards. It's deferred compensation and pension board. So deferred compensation is like the employee-driven investment accounts. There was consistent interest in looking at combining the 2. And in fact, this has been looked at before. Staff was able to share some information that they'd worked on with the attorney's office previously. I'll go ahead and tell you, staff does not recommend combining those boards because they have very different functions. Most notably, the pension board on behalf of ACC Gov is about risk management and making sure that we have the funding and methods in place to meet the obligations we're making. Whereas deferred compensation is more about like plan structure. However, if you would like to direct us to further flesh that out, we'd be happy to do so. So we are looking for a little feedback on this one. If you're okay to leave them as 2, or if you want more detail.
I mean, flush it out. And the reason I say that, I kind of see them as both together. And I hear what you're saying about the pension board because they're trying to make sure that the funds are available for people once they retire, but also in deferred compensation, though, we're trying to help people get there. So with the pen on the pension. So I guess the only conflict it would be from one staff on some of the deferred.
I believe there's a staff presence on both. There's a retiree on the pension.
Is he still on there?
I don't know yet.
He used to be a. I just made that, you know, this bucket list, just thank him if you can. But yeah, we do a deep dive and then maybe somebody will say, well, you know what, that may not work, so.
We'll bring you more details, for sure, and explain what our reservations are about particularly those two. But we'd be happy to pull it together.
Yeah, I like to keep them separate. After reading about their mission and the plan, the work that they did, it makes sense to keep them separate and combine them.
I'm gonna disagree with my colleague, but.
Sure.
Well, again, let's do it.
I'm ambivalent.
Okay.
I can change, I'll change.
And you don't have to, none of these, we're not asking you to decide anything right now. We just wanted to kind of show you where things were.
Get to the good stuff.
PSCOB, no, I missed one. Public safety civilian oversight, a fairly new one. Again, there was a pretty strong desire to retain it as is, so we would not recommend any further investigation. Human Relations Commission, this is where we're starting to see some deviation. And most of these comments were not wildly deviating from Human Relations Commission. It was really more focused on this commission on people with disabilities, which is a dormant 30-person behemoth. I actually don't know why it was created, but it seems to be associated with some desire to look at funding. So based off of this, and then of course the next one, this particular commission, what we would recommend is we will investigate what it would look like to fold in some of those functions.
What I understand, this was created to help implement the ADA.
Yeah.
So it was created, yeah, when federal legislation passed, it was to help this community implement. So it's kind of just, you know, general parlance now that you implement the ADA.
So, based off of what's here, what we would do is we will look at folding them together, and should you not want to dilute the Human Relations Commission's function and purpose, then we would come back to you and say you should probably sunset this commission.
Cause we could, commission on people, just really could go with the other.
Correct. That's what we're going to look into and kind of show you what that would be. Vision Committee, strong sense to retain that. We will note that they become more involved in funding, review, and scoring. This one does lack an ordinance, so we would recommend that we go ahead and codify it in ordinance, because I don't know if the attorney's office is aware. I don't think we're aware of the enabling legislation that put this one in place. So
We just know it's required by the federal government for our CDBG and home funds. In our COC, we have to have somebody there to help us for citizen input. But I'm not sure about any ordinance. We're supposed to have 10. Right now we have 8, and we had applications to get 2 more.
Yeah. Do we have to have 10 in that federal?
I don't know where the number 10 came from. It's always been 10 since I've been here. It's just, I mean, I guess it's just to ensure that we're getting the strongest voice of as many residents as we can, because they are serving as that resident engagement portion that's required for federal funding. So they are the voice. It would be impossible for us to get enough resident input going out publicly. So that serves that.
Athens Cultural Affairs Commission, there is a strong desire to retain, so we would recommend no further action on that one. Community Tree Council, this is where things start to kind of converge. So the consensus was to not keep it in its individual form. We will note that a tree board is required for state certifications, but there are many other communities that actually use their Keep Beautiful or some other affiliated board. They just broaden their focus. And so we would evaluate these combination concepts you see above and come back to you with maybe a recommendation on what that could look like. Or we take a deeper dive with staff. We may come back to you with some explanation on why we wouldn't go that way, but more details.
These are all boards that nominate their own members too, so it's not,
Yeah.
Yeah.
PACC, all three of those do.
Yeah.
correct?
Well, I think the Greenway Commission has some non-ACC Gov appointees,
Five.
Yeah,
but yes, they do a recommendation to.
so it's not something that goes through our big BAC interview process.
Correct. So moving to the Greenway Commission, you saw again a desire to combine. I think Commission was really acknowledging with these various ones that there's an environmental component, some overlap now. One thing unique about our Greenway in general and is reflected in our Greenway Commission is our Greenway is both a conservation corridor and the multi-use path. And so in this case, there was some discussion around Athens in Motion. Could you kind of move that trail planning component to that board? And what we'll do is we'll go look at it. I did also want to note that this is the one that has 5 members appointed by UGA. And my understanding, that intention is because the Greenway plan involved university property. And so it was a way to engage the university in that planning and advisory process. And so that's something that ultimately the Mayor and Commission will have to keep in mind should they want to sustain that if they do anything different here.
But I do believe that's been a little challenging sometimes from their membership standpoint of having those appointments made.
Yeah.
It may not be the case now, but I know historically that's been.
Well, now that the Greenway is part of the campus leg of the Greenway is pretty much complete, maybe that isn't necessary. Maybe not that 5, 1 or 2 maybe.
Sure. And certainly there are many individuals who work for and with UGA who you all choose to appoint to your BACs anyhow through an application process. So it would not eliminate that opportunity. Keep Athens-Clarke County beautiful. Again, noting kind of that overlap. Now, we did want to flag on this one. There is a nonprofit that's kind of in tandem with this BAC. They're not one and the same, but it's maybe an extension of it. And so that's just something that staff will have to discuss as we bring back some ideas for you. Athens in Motion was perhaps the most polarizing of the BACs. So you saw approximately a third would like to go ahead and sunset it. About a quarter of folks who responded wanted to retain, and then the combination really spoke to Greenway Commission or T-Splost oversight. So we would, based off of this, recommend that we investigate that combination opportunity.
So I want to I have something to say about this. When I ran for office, I advocated strongly for this kind of commission because it was a pain in the butt, the commission debating every single bike ped sidewalk project that came through. So there was tons and tons of wasted time, and us as commissioners who don't necessarily have a lot of expertise in these things, trying to come up with the nitty-gritty details of it. Having this commission has relieved a tremendous burden from the elected officials and put some folks with some real expertise, folks who actually do walk and bike and keep up with the literature, keep up with the studies, and who are able to advise the commission. I would recommend that this not go away, just seeing how it's evolved and why it was conceived of.
But it's not very diverse.
No, it's not. And then that's up to us, that's up to us. We need to do better, reaching out in the community and recruiting people who want to engage in this kind of envisioning.
Yeah, we got that.
Yeah, I mean,
And this ain't probably not time to talk about, but different communities want different things. Some communities want bike lanes and sidewalks, some communities don't. So I think we need to really look at if and when we start putting people on if we keep it, then we need to really look at who we put on those.
But we spent a lot of money on that plan and engaging that consultant, and there were years and years of public input. And the concept is that, we have different communities within our entire community, but you have to get through those communities. It's about connecting.
So, just not, cause I know this one's gonna be a hard one, but does staff, is there duplicity when it comes to staff?
No, I wouldn't say that there's duplicity. In fact, these staff notes I got from, this is one of the ones where I reached out ahead of time because I could see that divergence. And so what they did want to point out is two things. One is right now, one of the values Athens in Motion offers to staff is that it's very active in the outreach and education side of things. And so if they were to be discontinued as a commission, staff would either have to pick up that slack, investing, time and resources, or it would be discontinued. And then the second thing to keep in mind, at least for the time being, is that the plan is currently undergoing an update. So if you wanted to sunset this one or dramatically change its function, I would recommend you wait until the plan is at least updated, because normally any plan that we're working on of this nature, even if it doesn't have a formal BAC, does get some kind of either a mayor's appointed advisory group or some other advisory group.
The one thing that I would recommend with this committee is to have a more clear outreach and education process. So that there is, some front end outreach to specific communities that are impacted by specific projects. So it doesn't come in on the tail end after there's a concept.
I had no idea they had outreach in education.
They do, but there's at the farmer's market and at festivals and things like that, but there really should be more directly going into communities, into churches, community centers, flyering neighborhoods, that kind of thing.
That's really good, important one. You may remember, this is one of the ones that when we first started looking at this, and it's clearly from a legal perspective, we'll decide, because policy matter is not my concern, but this is one that was established by resolution, so it definitely needs an ordinance. And one of the problems that we identified from a legal perspective is that the resolution is so minimal and doesn't speak to what it currently does. So the only thing it says, as far as what they're functionally supposed to do, is they're established to advise the mayor and commission on the development, implementation, and modification of an Athens in Motion plan for a safe and connected network of bicycle and pedestrian facilities. So if this is to be kept, I think from a legal perspective, it would be helpful to have some additional clarification from the mayor and commission as to what you actually want this body to do. Because arguably, once the plan was created, I mean, obviously there can be future redevelopments and things, but their focus is related to the plan, and I don't think that realistically that is always been the only thing that they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So based on the resolution, they are non-existent because the plan has already been created.
It doesn't have any kind of it doesn't say when they end.
Does it say implementation? Did I hear that?
It does say implementation. So I'm not staff and that I can't speak to how much of their efforts are related to implementation. It also says modification. So with another plan coming up, but if there's an expectation about education and outreach, it might be helpful to clarify what that is.
Okay.
Another place where you see an entity like this being proposed, many times a BAC or its individual members will actually submit for T-SPLOST or SPLOST proposals. I will point out, and I actually think this is a good thing, many times they will prioritize projects that maybe staff don't prioritize, because staff are living in the nuts and bolts of how do we sustain what we've got, and maybe not in touch with portions of the community and understanding their needs. And so it's neither here nor there, but that is another value that's emerged over time.
Andrew, two quick things. One is, I just wanted to mention, and attorney's office, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the whole resolution versus ordinance thing, going back to that land bank question, as opposed to some of these others that we've advocated, is that state law or establishment, if I'm correct, mentions that you can do it by resolution or ordinance.
Yeah, so land-based authorities can be established by resolution. The crux that's strange in our charter is that boards, authorities, commissions are supposed to be established by ordinance, not resolution. So the mayor could create a committee by resolution, but this unfortunately just got caught up in sort of a weird crossfire.
I just wanted to mention that since that came up earlier, kind of as to why we need to talk about local BAC specifically. The other thing I was going to point out is, one thing I would just mention from an education and outreach initiative is, keep in mind that Athens in Motion is an advocacy organization. And we just, sometimes when it comes to project specific stuff, we would urge a little bit of caution on utilizing, that was what I would say is sort of a staff proxy for getting input on things versus overall education about Athens in Motion and a plan and pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure and things like that. Because, can be some challenges that we've seen at times for other things where, the Mayor Commission doesn't always, obviously, take their recommendations when making decisions. And we just want to be a little bit careful from communications department perspective and the other departments of making sure that we're being careful about elements of, what they might be going out and doing from an education outreach initiative on specific project related stuff. That would just be a little bit of a caution, I would say, to try to have a little bit of dichotomy there.
So presentation, all that.
Well, they're an advocate. All the BACs to some degree are, they're going to have opinions on things, and that's perfectly fine within their process of doing that. I think what we want to avoid is when we're looking to get public input on projects, depending on the time that it is in there of how those are developed, if that's something that's coming into staff and that staff is working on those versus, volunteers and a BAC coming in and talking about specific projects and things that they would do, which may or may not be aligned with what you all are looking to do or what a plan might state. There's just a gray area we've come across in certain things before to where we've been able to maintain, I think, a pretty good separation of absolutely, have this education, have this outreach on things like that. They do a lot of that. To your point, Commissioner Lincoln, they're in a lot of events and they are very visible with talking about infrastructure and stuff. We don't have any issue at all with any components of that. We just would want to be a little bit careful on a specific roadway project if that presentation was being sort of from them versus saying from. And it's not been a problem really so far. I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, I feel like they could be utilized by staff more in that front end outreach.
Well, I do think.
Staff's, transportation staff's forte is not community outreach. They're engineers, they're about the nuts and bolts. But we do have this citizen commission that, kind of exists for that kind of community connectivity. And I feel like there should be more utilization of them on the front end to get directly into communities, before project concepts are completed.
And I'm okay with that, but at the same time, if you open my jail, a BAC should not be critical of a project if a community wants something different, and we have had some of that. And just recently with North Avenue deal, so let's don't pretend that never happened. It does, so we need to be careful, and they need to be careful that if the community want one thing, they went out and got help to get that. So be it, but don't be critical because that community wanted they want that specific way. And all of us got emails from people criticizing what happened. So that should happen.
Yeah, let's move on. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Thank you.
So SPLOST and T-SPLOST oversight are a bit of an anomaly. So arguably the citizen committee that is helping to advise on the actual body of SPLOST and T-SPLOST or tier 3 are mayor appointed. And in our community, the mayor reaches out to you all to give some recommendations. Following that, we kind of transitioned into this oversight role, and it's been this way my entire career. I don't know if Jeff noticed when it came to be. And they're then just checking to make sure that what's being deployed, developed, built in our community is consistent with what we said we were going to do.
So, but I have a question for Sherry, for the attorney. The mayor has the right to create and appoint these committees. How do we stop that? Here's my train of thought. Here's my train of thought. So like, you look at the SPOS and the T-SPOS, there's like 20 something. Sometimes all those 20, so you have the SPOS oversight, you have T-SPOS oversight. Like, all right, then you may have the Lexington Road or Pacific Project Oversight Committee. That's
The user group,
user group.
yeah.
That's a lot.
And they're mostly staff. I mean, the user group ones are very specific.
One or two people from the
One or two
community.
community members and
But
staff with real technical
It's
knowledge.
very, to me, it's even trying to pick those people to be on those specific projects, it's exhausted. And I'm like, why don't we do, here's my train of thought, and I thought the staff budget. Why don't we just do, instead of having these committees and this, for this specific reason, and y'all, please hear me out. Why don't we just do surveys? You know, sit down a survey. We got the Lexington Road survey for, here's what staff is proposing, this is what the voters voted on, provide your input. Instead of having these meetings after meetings after meetings and.
Well, I think the meetings, the technical, I mean, I've sat in on some of those oversight committee meetings back in the day.
Mhm.
And I mean, there's a lot of technical work that gets done in those meetings that I don't think is appropriate for a survey type.
But here's what my constituents have said, like, staff does all the work and our community members, they will say, here's a suggestion, but they're gonna tend to lean on what staff, because they have the technical expertise. So why have the committee at all?
Well, and to be clear, the user groups are manager appointed. And they're manager appointed so that we have that technical expertise, whether it's from the community or throughout the project. So the concept and then as it's deployed. So that doesn't require anything from the mayor and commission. But then to your point, once those carry forward,
Mhm.
we go through SPLOST or T-SPLOST oversight to make sure what the user group is recommending is consistent. And then at times, we may have other groups involved. So for example, if it's a Greenway project, the Greenway Commission may make a recommendation, or Athens in Motion may make, so you're getting advice from multiple people. Now, I will say SPLOST and T-SPLOST oversight is very administrative. In other communities, there isn't a board like this. Typically, that's done at a staff level with public notice.
There you go.
So you may be able to do that, but because this one lives in the between a 2 and a 3, I don't know that I could advise you that you have the ability to terminate, because arguably the mayor, this is an evolution of a mayor's committee. I think you have the, should you choose to, you could recommend that it be codified and sustained. I think you could also request that the mayor stop doing it.
I'd be really uncomfortable with eliminating these I mean, I believe that, you know, our community is unique well, not unique, but, you know, kind of goes above and beyond in that we do have these citizen committees working on these projects. It's not like the government just being an overlord and deciding where your tax dollars go and how I mean, we do have these levels of community input. And I think that's valuable, and I hear from citizens that appreciate it.
And I will say too, that just from a survey perspective, we'll call them surveys technically or not, but we do tend to, if there's projects that have some decision making need, even if they have user groups, we do tend to often have a comment opportunity for people to do that.
And not every community does that. We do have many layers of public comment and, you know, some public representation in the early conceptual phases that doesn't happen in other places. And as cumbersome as it is, it's extremely valuable.
The other thing y'all could choose to do is just leave this one undiscussed. It stays as basically a mayor level 3, and then if this mayor or a future mayor wants to go a different direction, they fully have that prerogative.
I mean, I'd like to see it codified because I wouldn't like the idea of a future mayor getting rid of this citizen process. You know, it was conceived of when SPLOST first became a thing.
No.
30 years ago, I guess. And it's just been a tradition. And I think that, you know, there could be a time in the foreseeable future when, you know, someone forgets that there was this demand from the community to have this community involvement. From the get. I think it would be worth codifying, injecting it into an ordinance, to make sure that it carries on. And as far as like the combination of T-Splosh and Splosh, I think that's just asking for trouble, and that you'd have one committee having way much more work to do. You know, like this is divvying it up a little bit, and you know, there certainly is there's a big difference between like a library project and a sidewalk project, or a stormwater project, you know,
And I do
or
think,
our park project.
I think you're right that I remember it with SPLOST 4, which was passed in 94, coming up, I think was. But and I believe that the majority, if not all of the ones that come from the oversight are people that come to it from the advisory committee in the first place, from that larger committee. I believe that's been the case historically,
Often, yeah.
since we've had advisory committees, which wasn't at the beginning, but was later on.
Yeah, sometimes people don't want to carry on, and you have to, you know, replace your appointment.
It's a smaller group. It's a much smaller.
And I mean, maybe what we do is we, you know, right now we each commissioner appoints 2 members, maybe go down to each appointing
One.
1, but then again, you have people who don't show up, so you don't have that community represented.
Now, that's for the advisory.
Advisory, yeah.
The oversight committee is what? 10, maybe?
Yeah.
And the oversight for us is filling or closely aligned with some of the law around transparency and disclosure, right? So the law says you have to keep a project budget, and you have to do regular reporting on what progress. You have to have an estimated timeline, that kind of thing. So by having these committees, those boxes are being checked because this content is regularly produced for the committee. And so if you didn't have them, you'd have to go more and model what other communities do. And I don't hear that consensus in this room. So I guess the question I have is, do you want to evaluate combination opportunities? Or you just want to leave it as it is?
So I like to keep it the way it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I'd like to bring up the idea of
And
codifying it as an ordinance.
Okay, we'll look into that. And then TAD advisory committees is second to last group. So there are 6. I will tell you that is not sustainable from a staffing perspective. We actually have participation struggling. So we would like to come back to you with a combination concept. And what I would say is maybe these are like working groups until the plan is brought to the commission. And then it comes into like a broader, just TAD advisory committee for all 6 TADs.
And that's the mayor's
No, these are actually in the ordinance.
ordinance.
So all 6 of them are done in an ordinance.
It's called committees, again, this was
Right.
before we realized some of the issues with what we call them.
Yeah, so probably the TAD advisory commission may be where you land on this, but we would suggest it needs some work. Then ARPA are also neither fish nor fowl, but because they were created with commission action, typically in either an agenda report or a CDO, we're treating them as a level 2, and everybody said, let's sunset everybody, but consensus was to sunset them, and that would be our recommendation as well. So a little bit of a summary here. There's been some changes we've discussed today, most notably around that SPLOST and T-SPLOST oversight no longer being under a combination that's going to be investigated. So as we come back to you in the next meeting, we'll focus on those combinations, and we will say, okay, if you combine, take this function for people with disabilities and put it in Human Relations Commission, here's what that means. Or we may come back to you and say, as we've looked at Hearings Board and Construction Board of Appeals, because it's so technical, we actually don't recommend you combine it, but here's 4 points on why. And then you could still say, well, that's cool. We still want you to combine them. But that we'll flesh out details around those combination concepts. And specifically, another change that I noted was a desire for more detail on pension and deferred compensation.
So I feel like there's another question to be had. Could some of these boards appoint their own members or recommend their own members? I'm looking at them, and like the ones that are under retained, I feel like those are ones that do need to be, public outreach and mayor and commission interview. And it looks like most of the ones in the combination are already appoint their own well, not really. I mean, I'm just wondering, do we want to talk about enabling some of these to appoint their own?
As we narrow in on this, we will be revisiting and providing more content on some of that oversight, like the policy manual, if you will, or the handbook. And so we might be able to have more context for you where you can decide if you would like to sustain that activity for certain groups or if you want to abandon it altogether.
So, yeah, just real briefly, the BAC, it's huge. So, I think there are 3 steps. Which one we're gonna combine, which one needs to go into ordinance, and which ones needs to be, restructured. So we're just on the first leg of this BAC debacle, so.
Yeah. So we're gonna run this one home. Probably not the next meeting, but.
And I was gonna say, we can also get some feedback, if you all would like, from, some of the liaisons. Oh, sorry, Andrew. I was just gonna say specifically to that point, I know some of our liaisons and talking to them that do their own appointment, it's been challenging for them. But we can also kind of ask the other one. I know for CTC, for example, it's been very hard for them. I don't know about the Greenway Commission, and ACAC has had some challenges too with that. We can get some feedback on liaisons specifically about those that recommend and those that don't.
Yeah, I mean, they don't seem to put a very public call out. Like, I feel like if they had a more public call out and they took care of the interview process, maybe they would get more candidates.
So I will tell you that some of that has been a little frustrating to us because from a trade perspective, there've been several times that we'll do our big sort of push for regular BACs, and they'll put something out like right afterwards or right before, and it's challenging because they're 2 entirely different processes. So it becomes a little complicated for us to try to communicate, well, if you want to do these, do this. If you want to do this, do this. And other times they've kind of left them ongoing. Like I know CTC is pretty much all the time. There's some good and bad about that because it doesn't necessarily, we help push it when we can at certain times. But because the processes are sort of different, it is a little bit of a challenge from that. So we do hope to maybe when that comes into play, finally deciding, okay, here are the ones we want to do it with.
Yeah.
Make that a little bit better with them so that it's more on a time schedule. Even when you do yours, it's kind of generally time, but it's not specifically time. But some others are specifically time, like, we do it by appointment for the beginning of the year. Okay, and it's trying to figure out those timeframes so that we can help them get the word out too.
Those do the best job. They do their own.
It's smooth.
They smooth.
But we still have to interview.
But they do a really good job though, of getting the word out. Maybe we should talk with them. They get the word out, even the community, the recommendation, and narrow it down, then they send to us.
And I think that hospital authority is relatively small number of people. Yeah, I think the CTC is, I think it's 15.
It's big, like that.
And so some of it is a problem of, and the other thing is, you don't get 8, you don't have a quorum.
Yeah, well, and most of the people on it are ex officio, so there's actually just a really small number who can actually vote and apply to the quorum, so it's challenging.
Well, as we wrap up, I have 2 questions that we need answered from you all. The first is, as we look at these combination concepts, do you want us to engage with the BACs or do you want us to hold off on that? Because I think as you start to ask that, it's going to create a lot of uncertainty. On the other hand, they may have perspectives that you want to know now. So pause there.
I think it's worth reaching out. I mean, I've talked to folks on the CTC about this conversation that we're having this committee, which is a public conversation.
Sure. So what we can do is we can we can bring that, we'll put together, and then we may have a separate column for kind of BAC insights. Now, because they all meet in different sequences and we're in December, you may not get that feedback exactly at your next meeting, so we'll accommodate that. Second thing is, let's say we decide, boom, there's never been a better marriage than the Tree Council and the Greenway Commission. It makes total sense, everybody's on board. The process of then writing that ordinance and doing, that takes a lot of work. Are you all okay if we reach a point where you all say, and the other thing is, I also want to point out is, even though we've surveyed your peers, when we bring that information back, they may say, well, I've reconsidered. Do you want to go back to your peers with recommendations on that would direct staff in the attorney's office to return with an ordinance for a revised BAC, or are we gonna move our way through each ordinance for a combination as a
Go back.
committee?
I say go back to the planning commission.
And it could be that when we go back to your peers, that conversation, you'll get really good insights, but you may then decide, well, actually, we better go write a few ordinances together. But I think definitely a check-in with a concept is probably a great product for them.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we have our next steps and we appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Motion to the list. Oh, go ahead.
You approved October's meeting minutes, but not your November. I didn't know if you wanted to do that.
I'm sorry. Motion to approve November meeting minutes.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Yeah, you're good.
I can't believe it's December. but-
Do we actually?
How do I do?
A motion to adjourn?
Second.